From Washington, D.C., this is Middle East Focus.
Welcome to Middle East Focus. This is Jerry Feierstein, Senior Vice President at the Middle East Institute. With the GCC Summit getting ready to kick off in a few days, I have with me today two of the United States' preeminent scholars on Arabian Peninsula and Gulf affairs. Giorgio Cafiero is CEO and founder of Gulf State Analytics and a regular contributor to the Middle East Institute. Greg Gause is head of the Department of International Affairs at the George Bush School of Government and Public Service at Texas A&amp University and the John H. Lindsay 44 Chair. Welcome to you both. Greg, let me start with you, and just a broad question of whether or not you think that this GCC summit, following what was generally considered to be the failure of the summit last December, is a make or break for the GCC.
So I don't think it's make or break. The GCC is in trouble. There's no question about it. There's very little that the 6 countries will agree to do jointly that makes any difference. But the organization, although it's going through probably its roughest patch in its history, has had some rough patches in the past. I think that there's a certain inertia in these organizations. I doubt that the GCC is going to be very effective for a while, but I can't imagine that it's going to close up shop. And as personalities change and as policies change, I could see it being revived. I don't think that the GCC was in the greatest shape before the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait, but it proved to be a very useful vehicle for the countries to cooperate and to present a united front on the international scene. Again, that's not going to happen anytime in the short term going forward, but I doubt that we've seen the last of the organization as an organization.
So do you expect that all of the leaders are actually going to wash up in Riyadh?
I think that every country will be represented. Why don't we put it that way? I don't know if all the leaders will arrive in Riyadh, but I think every country will be represented.
Okay. Well, Giorgio, let me turn to you and ask what I think is the $64,000 question about this summit, and that is, do we expect that this is going to be an opportunity for the Saudis and Emiratis and the Qataris to kiss and make up? Do we expect that there's going to be a resolution of the boycott of Qatar, which is now entering its 18th month?
I'm quite skeptical. I don't think that this summit taking place this month in Saudi Arabia is going to lead to any sort of speedy resolution of the GCC crisis. Will this summit be able to bring the parties closer to a resolution, I think, is an important question, and that will depend on a few factors. Yes, representatives of all GCC states will attend, but which representatives? Heads of state? How high-ranking will these officials be? What is the interaction going to be like between the representative of Qatar and his or her counterpart from the blockading countries? What is going to be the content of discussion at the summit? Will they even discuss the blockade or not? We don't know the answers to these questions, and we also don't know if this is going to last more than a few hours like the last GCC summit in Kuwait. But given how much emotion is injected into this dispute and how much pride there is, I think it's going to be really difficult to imagine these two sides stepping down just because they were all able to meet at the same summit this month.
Press reported that Abdul Latif Azayani, the Secretary General of the GCC, flew personally to Doha to deliver the invitation to Sheikh Tamim. Do we have any idea what the response was?
What I have understood from analysts who are focusing on Qatar very closely is that there's a lot of doubt that the Emir of Qatar is going to accept this invitation and go to Saudi Arabia. But nonetheless, Doha faces a little bit of a dilemma right now. If they were to have the Emir attend, that would send the message that Qatar is showing some interest in some reconciliation. But at the same time, if they don't send the Mir. It could offer the blockading countries an opportunity to try to convince officials in Washington that Qatar is the problem and this country is not being serious about moving past the dispute. So certainly a sensitive dilemma that they're going to have to make a decision about very soon.
And the Qataris, I think, caught the world by surprise with their announcement just a couple of days ago that they intend to withdraw from OPEC on the 1st of January. Now, they were never major players, OPEC being an oil-producing cartel, and the Qataris don't produce very much oil. They're primarily a gas producer. Nevertheless, symbolically, is this being interpreted as a signal that the Qataris are not interested in repairing the damage?
I think some people are certainly interpreting it that way. I think there's good reason to view this decision sort of a swipe at Riyadh. At the end of the day, OPEC is an institution that Saudi Arabia is a de facto driver of. And while the Qatari leadership emphasized that this decision to leave the cartel was not political, it's important to realize that this decision was made in a new environment with different political dynamics, whereby Qatar is no longer sensitive to the interests of Saudi Arabia. Probably a few years ago, this would have been unimaginable, and certainly in the pre-1996 era, we couldn't have imagined Qatar doing this. So I think this is really about Doha sending a message that it doesn't see Saudi Arabia as a responsible leader in the region, and Qatar wants to chart a new future where it's not a part of Saudi-led institutions in the region.
In fact, the Qataris made specific mention of the fact that one of the reasons that they were withdrawing is that they did not want to be a part of an institution that was led by another government, without ever saying Saudi Arabia, but everyone understood that. Greg, the other major story that's going to come out of this summit is Mohammed bin Salman, and what is the body language? How is he received? Is he going to be the dominant player? Is he going to chair the session since Saudi Arabia is the host, or is he going to be in a reduced position? And is King Salman going to really lead the Saudi delegation and the talks? How do you see the Saudis playing this? And is this the beginning of, or the continuation of, the Mohammed bin Salman repairing the damage tour?
So I would assume that if the king is up to it health-wise, he'll lead the delegation, at least for the opening session, just because the Saudis do put some stock in the GCC, and it would be the king's role to do that. But this really isn't the venue in which Mohammed bin Salman would be doing his return to prominence tour. I mean, no one in the Gulf questions his role, at least in any public way. And so I think that the effort to restore his reputation was more the G20. It's not the GCC, and the places where he has to restore his acceptability are in Europe and the United States and North America. They're not in the Gulf. So I wouldn't read too much into either whether he's in the first chair or sitting next to his father, and I wouldn't read too much into the body language either. I think we'll start to read body language when President Trump receives him next.
And do you expect that to come anytime soon?
Probably not anytime soon if one takes the temperature of the U.S. Congress. I think that that there are a number of steps that are going to have to be taken before the White House is going to be willing to do a big splashy event with the Crown Prince. To me, the bigger question is, what kind of leverage is the White House willing to use on Riyadh to try to get some policy changes out of this? Policy changes that Washington says it wants, whether it be on the Yemeni front, whether it be on the Gulf boycott of Qatar front, or whether it be on some kind of personnel change within Riyadh. That doesn't mean that MBS is out. That's not going to happen. But perhaps a new foreign minister who has some seniority within the family, who would be somebody that America would deal with on a day-to-day basis. I think that there are a lot of things on the agenda that the Trump administration has at least given some hints that they would like to see. And before we see progress on on that, I don't think you're going to see MBS being received at the White House.
I want to come back to the Yemen question in a moment, but pursuing that, one of the priorities for the administration, of course, has been launching the Middle East Strategic Alliance, the so-called Arab NATO. Of course, a lot of questions in many people's minds about how realistic that organization might be, given the fact that, one, the level of security and defense cooperation among the GCC states was pretty weak at the best of times, and this isn't the best of times, as we've discussed. So again, the Saudis had been interested in the organization, interested in the philosophy of trying to have the GCC plus Jordan and Egypt in a security alliance. Mohammed bin Salman had been a major advocate of that within the GCC. Is that now off the table? Do you expect that some conversation about that might come up in the summit?
Well, I questioned whether it was ever really on the table. I'm old, so I remember in 1991, the last time we were going to have an Arab NATO. It was a 6+2 proposition. It was going to be the GCC and Egypt, and this time Syria, because Syria had joined the coalition against Saddam Hussein, and King Hussein of Jordan, for all sorts of very understandable reasons, had tilted toward Saddam. And this was launched by an American administration that was at the height of its power in the region, was led by President George Herbert Walker Bush, Secretary of State James A. Baker III, who we're remembering this week as the masters of regional diplomacy in the Middle East and in the world in general. And nothing came of it. All of these states—
Fortunately.
Yes, yeah, one could argue, fortunately, nothing came of that. All of these states, it seems to me, value their relationship with Washington more than they value their relationship with each other. And they all want to have that direct relationship with Washington. We've seen this even in modest efforts by the United States to encourage the GCC to cooperate on procurement issues and all sorts of other things. Each of these states, even the smallest of them, for very good reasons, as the Qataris are recognizing with this boycott, want to have their own bilateral relationship with Washington. So I never thought that this was going to be a practical plan anyway, and I doubt that we're going to see any movement on it.
Well, let me come back then to the issue of Yemen, Giorgio, and to ask you, we have, of course, the confluence of two events in December. One, of course, is the GCC Summit. The other is what we anticipate might be as soon as later this week, of Martin Griffiths launching a new round of political negotiations in Stockholm that will include, as we understand, some Saudi participation, along with the Hadi government and the Houthis. And clearly, the Yemen issue has been one other issue that has been quite divisive within the GCC, not only between the Qataris and the Saudis and Emiratis, but also, of course, between Oman and Saudi Arabia. And is this going to be an opportunity for the parties, if they so desire, to try to reconcile their different approaches to the Yemen conflict and to see whether, as a GCC, they might not be more supportive of what the United Nations is trying to accomplish?
There are definitely some conflicts of interest vis-a-vis Yemen among different GCC states. The only real two GCC states that are heavily involved in Yemen at this point are obviously Saudi Arabia and the UAE. They have their own conflicts of interest with respect to the south of Yemen, probably some different views on other actors in the country. Qatar obviously left the coalition. I think is probably pretty happy that they're no longer a part of the coalition as one of the positive outcomes of the blockade. Kuwait is not really playing any major role, and Bahrain is mainly there for symbolic reasons, and Oman has staunchly opposed the Arab Gulf states' intervention in Yemen. I think these fundamental differences and of interests and perceptions are unlikely to change anytime soon. I think in Muscat, Oman, there is a real interest in seeing to it that the Saudis and Emiratis stop the bombing campaigns in Yemen and the Houthis stop firing rockets and missiles into the GCC countries. Oman has, of course, played a very special role that I think we're going to have to keep on focusing on as really the only GCC state that has some sort of relationship with the Houthis in which there is real trust in play. I think there's sort of a similar dynamic regarding the Yemen crisis as well as the Qatar crisis, and that has to do with this issue of how can MBS step back in a way that enables him to save face. Obviously, this campaign in Yemen is so costly for Saudi Arabia in terms of blood and treasure. But if they were to just stop military operations in Yemen, I think there's a big concern that this would be seen not only in Saudi Arabia and also Iran, but throughout the whole region as ultimately a big Iranian victory. It's difficult to imagine MBS agreeing to something like that.
Well, let me ask you. You introduced the Persians into the equation, so let me pursue that a little bit, and ask if you were an Iranian policymaker, what would you be looking for in the GCC summit, and what would make you happy, and what would make you sad?
I think ever since the GCC was established in the early 1980s, the Islamic Republic has always been keen to try to exploit divisions between the different members of the GCC and also divisions and tensions between some GCC members and Washington. I think Iran is really the only victor of the GCC crisis. I can't really think of any country that's benefited from it as much as Iran has. I think and officials in Iran can probably be pretty optimistic about the crisis continuing, giving Iran very special opportunities to bring its relationship with Qatar to new heights. I think Iran is also optimistic about its future relationship with Oman. So I think probably officials in Tehran are going to sort of sit back and probably expect this division to continue, and they'll be very happy about that.
And Greg, let me ask you. You were with us today in a Turkey conference, talking about, among other things, the Turkish relationship with the region, and particularly with the Gulf states. What's your sense of Ankara's interest, and what do you think that they would take away from the summit? What would they like to see? What would they regret?
I think that Erdogan made a play vis-a-vis Saudi Arabia, and specifically vis-a-vis the Crown Prince, regarding the killing of Jamal Khashoggi. And I think it's probably a losing play. I doubt that the Turks expect that much from the GCC summit. I think that it's going to take some time before there's a more normal relationship between Turkey and Saudi Arabia. Things weren't good before the Khashoggi killing. But I think that since I don't think that the Crown Prince is going to be dished out of power, even if he has his wings clipped, I doubt that there's going to be a whole lot of sentiment for cooperation with Ankara anytime soon coming from Riyadh. I think that the Turks are ultimately very pragmatic, though Mr. Erdogan has got his own ambitions in the region, and they'll find a way to climb down. But this was a pretty direct attack from the president of Turkey on the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia. And I don't think that's easily smoothed over.
Well, I think that that's all we have time for today. So I want to thank our two guests, Giorgio Cafiero and Greg Gause, for joining us. And most of all, as always, I want to thank our listeners for tuning in. If you like what you've heard, then be sure to tune in every week.
This has been a presentation of the Middle East Institute. To support MEI's programs and podcasts, please donate at www.mei.edu. Thank you for your support.